afternoon, good evening. I know we have a stellar panel today. I'm Susan Sirocco, Director of Creative Economy in Arlington Economic Development. You may know Arlington, Virginia. It was once home to the Clovis people, considered early ancestors of many Native American tribes. Pocahontas was thought to have lived here. But we're probably best known now for a national cemetery and new home to Amazon HQ2. So before we begin our session today on networks and practice in the creative economy, let's thank WestStaff again. They've done an incredible job. David Holland, Randy Engstrom, for crafting the framework for a convening that is bound to outlast our time together. Hasn't this really been invigorating and amazing? I wish we could all do a collective round of applause, but I'm sure they'll be hearing a lot more from everybody on how well this is going. So thank you. So with me today are panelists from around the globe. Please introduce yourselves with your name, affiliation, your time zone, and your preferred pronouns. Patton, let's start with you.
Thank you. I'm Patton Hindle. I'm the head of arts at Kickstarter. We're a public benefit corporation. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I am currently on Eastern time, and I'm based in Brooklyn, New York.
Rasmus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rasmus Winstedt Tscherning. I'm from Denmark, Copenhagen, Denmark. I go with him and his. I am with the Creative Business Network. We're a network of people working with creative industries in some 80 countries, startups, investors, stakeholders just as yourself, and we're really looking forward to this. Thank you for the invitation. I'm with in the Central European Summertime. That is Copenhagen, Paris, Rome, etc., all the way down to Cape Town.
Thank you. Althea.
Hey everybody, my name is Althea Erickson. I am hailing from Brooklyn Eastern Standard Time. I am currently unaffiliated and on a bit of a sabbatical, which is very pleasant. But until this May, I led impact and global public policy for Etsy, the online marketplace for creative goods. And prior to that, I led advocacy and policy for an organization called the Freelancers Union, which also served creative entrepreneurs. So happy to be here. Oh, and she and her are my preferred pronouns. Thanks.
Tom, thank you for joining us.
Hi, like Rasmus, I'm across the water. I used to be able to say I'm in Europe, but I don't think we can say that anymore because of Brexit. So I'm based in the UK.
Of course.
So my name's Tom Cahill-Jones. My pronouns are he, him. I am the partnerships manager for Nesta. I'm not sure if you know what Nesta is, but it's the UK's social innovation foundation. So we look at innovation for good. But there's a part of Nesta which is focused purely on the creative industries. That's where I'm located. It's called the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. And we look to create the kinds of arguments that help support the kind of policies that are needed to generate effectiveness and value within the creative industries.
I think we could stop there. That's incredible. No. Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Stern. I'm with Americans for the Arts. So glad to be here. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm calling in from Mountain Time from the lands of the Tewa, Ute, Ikari, Apache, and Comanche people, and really excited to be here. So thank you.
So thank you again all for being here. You know, we had an opportunity to have a prior discussion, as the panels have, to prepare for today, and it left us all, I think, really excited to continue this conversation and to really share it with this broader audience. So thank you again for being here. You know, we ended yesterday on a high note. For those of you who got to listen in on the sessions, a close conversation with Robert Bedoya, expertly guided by Randy Engstrom, emphasized the creative economies of belonging. This is something that is peripheral, but really essential to what creative economy is going forward. So whether you're in the public sector, nonprofit, or for-profit, I think our extensions to belong protect us from working in isolation. And I think we've seen a lot of evidence of that, especially this last year. But it's a perfect segue to our topic, networks and practice in the creative economy. I'd like to start out by asking you what kinds of networks do you facilitate and who's missing from the table? So I'm going to go kind of in reverse and go back to Jessica. I know that from an arts advocacy standpoint, there's always probably a review of who is being served. Tell us more about where you see networks and what you facilitate. Having been, by the way, just for full disclosure, I had the opportunity to work with Jessica on the private sector network. So I have an affinity for the work that she does.
And we have an affinity for you, Susan. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for this. And I will say that our Americans for the Arts' creative economy work and the networks that support that work build on a long and strong commitment to the nonprofit arts sector and community development work, especially in pursuit of pro-arts policy at the federal, state, and local levels. And I will also say that though we've had a long tradition of working in the business community to engage them in the arts, we weren't always explicitly focused on networks in the creative industries until just a few years ago. And again, I want to thank Susan for being really instrumental alongside David and many of the other speakers that have been here in this summit. And they have really helped Americans for the Arts move and change the way that we think about networks and practice in the creative economy and what our role as a national organization might be. And so, you know, our primary audience includes local arts agencies and their leaders, but also, you know, being a convener of networks of networks, and creating space for practitioners and advocates, the policymakers, the business leaders, research and academics. We know that we can be a facilitator of for-profit and nonprofit connections. And indeed, that's a primary goal for us. And I have been privileged to get to speak with Patton and Althea alongside many of the other nonprofit public sector folks to kind of understand what does it look like to start bridging these divides, and what does it look like in this country to think about bringing those networks closer together. We're also developing relationships with cultural strategists who are interested in the solidarity economy, particularly in worker-owned collectives, public banking, time banks, and particularly the wonderful folks at Art.coop. And we've learned so much from them, and our role, we know, is specifically around what are the concepts and the learning spaces and the practices that local arts agency leaders might need to support those kinds of economic and community benefit models. And then, of course, we also participate in and support the networks of federal policies around creative work, and are really excited to have been able to work with and support the Getting Creative Workers Working Coalition, and especially the policy outcomes around the Creative Economy Revitalization Act. I will say that we have a lot of work to do in how we show up in spaces, and I believe we need to be more intentional about building and participating in rural networks. And there's also, I think, a distinct opportunity for us to participate in international networks. So I'll pause there. Lots of exciting work and more to come.
So I really love what you're saying, because it's very hopeful. I mean, and I think that that's been a lot of the tenor of many of the conversations that I've listened in on throughout the day yesterday, is that there are, this is a moment where I think we are all listening to the hopeful sound of how we can work better together. I heard someone say in a recent panel, actually, who said, we can be bitter or we can be better. And I'd not heard that term before, and I feel as though I'm going to adopt it and think about it all the time now. So Tom, I feel as though you're looking through, getting a better understanding of what you do. Networks are really deliberate in your world, and tell us a little bit more about, where you are to date and what this new landscape might be an invitation to that didn't exist before. Because now that, we are not in a place where we're sitting all together in a room having awkward conversations of what used to be networking. Even if the beverages were non-alcoholic. I think that we have a different opportunity now to explore what networks are looking like. So Tom, I want to hear more about that. Tell us how you are managing that.
Absolutely. And before I respond to that, I just want to say thank you for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be at this summit. So yes, the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, our specific aim is to produce the highest quality evidence to make the strongest arguments to support the creative industries. So I think within that statement, there's an acknowledgement that maybe in the past, particularly in the UK, the kind of arguments that might have been made were based on quite fractured understanding of the creative industries landscape and the kind of data that might be available. So one of the things we're really trying to do in as diverse and inclusive a way as possible is produce the kind of research which patches the gaps in our understanding and also allows us to understand that the broad themes across the industries which can influence policy decisions. And when I'm talking about those themes, that they're obviously, like the creative industries is evolving all the time, and those themes are evolving all the time. But there are 5 that we focus on. Actually, these are expanding to 9 in the near future. So if you go on our website, you'll probably see 9 listed. But the 5 that we've historically focused on are broadcasting. So I'm sure you all know the BBC. Public service broadcasting is a big thing for the UK and the role that plays within culture. I think speaking to your point about what's coming in the future, the degree to which the channels of information which are available to people are publicly controlled or privately controlled is really, really important. We're doing some work at the moment looking at, there's a particular broadcaster in the UK called Channel 4, which is currently publicly owned, and it might be sold off. So we're looking at the potential ramifications of that and what that means for the media landscape. So broadcasting, internationalization of the creative industries. So obviously there's a lot of people working in creative industries who are like hyper local. They're sort of engaged with their immediate communities, but also it spans the whole globe. So what does that mean from a UK and international perspective? We also look at thematically intellectual property and licensing. So we've been doing some work around streaming and the kind of the rights that artists have compared to the big record companies, and whether the divisions of labour are equal and the remuneration is fair. We've also got a theme which is focused on innovation, which is, I guess innovation is one of the areas which really resonates with the creative industries, because it's all about the new thinking, and people think that that must be very present in creative industries because creativity is all about new thought, but the ways in which creative industries innovate and how they can influence other sectors is an interesting thing for us. And then the final theme that we focus on is geography of the creative industries and how people are clustering around certain areas and the ways in which certain types of practice are emerging in different parts of the UK. So why is it that in one city people are heavily focused on the textile industry, whereas in another part they're focused on robotics, and in another part it's all about filmmaking or media production. So we're trying to produce the evidence which underpins those themes at the same time as interrogating those themes and seeing what kind of themes we might want to focus on in the future. And so just to talk directly to your point about what is coming up, I think one of the things that's becoming more and more prevalent in our work is trying to understand, and this has become more important through COVID and the fact that everyone's using Zoom and Teams and various platforms, is the effect of working remotely and digital practice on creativity and the creative industries specifically, particularly modes of content creation and distribution. So what does it mean if the people that you're going to be working with don't have to be in the same room together? And what does it mean if something that you produce on your home computer in your kitchen can go all the way around the world to the USA? It's these kind of dynamics are not that well understood at the moment, but we're seeing that they are really important to the future health of the creative industries. The other thing, just before I let someone else speak, is we're heavily invested in trying to understand skills, diversity, inclusion and equality, and what that means for the creative industry. So maybe later on I could talk you through some reports that we've produced on that topic, because I think there's things that are happening in the UK that might be interesting for an international audience as well.
No, let's not lose that thread, because training certainly is one of the things that I had made a note of to, that we may be able to touch on, and I think that's really important. Before I move on, though, I did want to just build on one thing that you said about, how are you thinking about these future and kind of topic areas that you're doing. It came up in one of the sessions yesterday around data, is how do you make sure that you reflect the deep enough information from the people that you're serving? And of course, surveys are one. But as I think H. Neidman from NEFA in Boston and New England mentioned, it's really the work of asking people, talking to people. So how do you make sure that you know what the areas are that of the networks that you're really trying to prosper? Is it, do you do some sort of surveys? And I think this is an important question, because I think that all of us really want to make sure that we're reflecting the work of the people that we're serving.
Sure. So the PEC itself, it has a particular structure which will help in my response to that prompt. So we have a core team of people who are working on the policy issues, but then we have 3 rings of influence, you might call them. So one ring is a series of 10 academic partners who are working on research related to the specific themes. Then we have another ring which consists of industry champions who are representative of the different people who work in the creative industries in the UK. And the third ring is a council of international experts who provide the global perspective on the creative industry. So those 3 rings, we try to activate them, but we also try to stimulate them to make sure they provide us with the kind of information that we need in order to be able to see what themes are coming. But I'd say, if I just talk specifically about the industry champions, we have 100 of those and rising at the moment, but despite the fact that the appointment of people to the particular role was subject to an open call, we found that there are certain areas which are not fully represented. So it's quite interesting that there's certain subsectors that are lacking in our perspective at the moment. So for example, we don't have enough men on the industry champions panel. We don't have enough people from non-white backgrounds on our industry champions panel, and we don't have enough representation from people under 30. So we're really trying to adopt methodologies which incentivize people from those groups to join our scheme and become part of the conversation. But in terms of the way that we do engage with the people who are currently included in our work, we run an annual survey. Every year we go out to the industry champions. There's a set of questions that we ask that are standardized, and then there's space to add a few more. The reason that, again, if we're thinking from the point of view of data and evidence, it is quite important to have questions that are similar from year to year, so that you can compare the results that you're obtaining. So that's maybe something to mention for people that are working in this domain. So we ask for insight into what people feel are the most pressing challenges for the creative industries. And we also ask people to identify which particular themes they think should be prioritised by policymakers, which aren't always the same as the ones that they consider to be the most pressing challenges, interestingly enough. So it's there's a process of going out to the outside world, trying to make sure that the evidence we collect is as representative as possible, bringing that back in and analysing it and using that to establish what themes we should focus on. One other thing I would say is that this point around access to data and data standards is so important. There's been a number of calls recently in the UK looking to try and set up services which provide people to certain types of data related to the creative industries. I don't know if it's the same in the USA or in Denmark, but at the moment there are lots of data sets out there, but they are controlled by gatekeepers, which means that or they're incomplete. You know, that it might be just someone who's collected data on a particular series of events over a number of years, but it isn't well packaged, it can't be well interrogated. So what that means is that the arguments that might be derived from that data are either not going to be produced by the people who are best positioned to make those arguments because they can't access the data, or if the right people are looking at the data, then maybe it's in such a state that good conclusions can't be drawn, which again means that you can't make strong arguments. So if you think about the policy world as requiring quite a high threshold, quite a the evidence has to be of good quality in order to convince a politician to do something. Well, you need to make sure there's really strong data there, and it's open, it's accessible to the people who might engage with it critically, so that the right kind of arguments can be made to bring about change, or just support the generation of energy within the creative industries.
So it has to continue to be comparable from one set to another. This is so fascinating. I think that we could probably have an entire session just on this topic, and particularly as we think about, I mean, we are leading kind of to a question of what kinds of things can we do to make our efforts more global, and this certainly could be a jumping off point. But so I'm going to move over to Patton to give us a little bit of your perspective. I mean, generally from the network standpoint, would love to hear you tell us a lot more about how Kickstarter is really, you know, more than just where you have that jumping off point for, you know, startup investment. And you know, I'm guilty of saying, okay, I know that I'm going to Kickstarter when someone sends me an email saying, please, can you contribute? Or, you know, we're trying to get this off the ground. So I may or may not be the best example of the good work that you do. But tell us more, because you are in a particularly interesting role there.
Sure. So Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform. It was founded in 2009. I should say that crowdfunding is not a new idea. The first instance of crowdfunding in the United States was actually the base of the Statue of Liberty. So originally when we were given the Statue of Liberty, we had to build a plinth for it, and the city only had so much money, and there was this controversy of whether it might go to Philadelphia or go elsewhere in the country that could afford it. And a group of citizens took out an ad in the newspaper and asked for people to contribute to it. And so people literally wrote checks and mailed them in. What's changed is the internet. And so our founder, Perry Chen, who is a visual artist, was living in New Orleans, and he wanted to bring this techno group from Berlin to New Orleans Jazz Festival. Really wanted to do it, couldn't figure out how to come up with the money, aside from trying to pitch individual sponsors, which he wasn't really interested in dealing with a brand or anything associated with it. And at that moment, this was in the early 2000s, he had the idea for a crowdfunding platform because he knew he had maybe like 20, 30 friends who could each give $25 or more, and that would make the trip possible. It took him, you know, almost 10 years with two other co-founders to get to the point of starting Kickstarter, but it is founded on the idea of community, and that community is centered around a creative work or an idea, something that people really believe in or buy into. So from that perspective, you are, yes, as you said, Susan, asked by people when they launch their projects to contribute to it, because appearing successful right at the beginning is very important in a Kickstarter project in order to sort of launch and have more people get eyes on it, because conversely to how people might think, if something's well funded, more people want to give money to it, instead of it looking sort of sad and not funding well. So there's a lot of strategy behind it, which is a lot of my role in working with artists, visual and performing artists, is to help them sort of carefully craft that message and build their community in advance of launching. I will say, interestingly, the projects that tend to perform quite well in the arts are actually social practice projects in nature or public works. So things that literally invite somebody into a creative process, which is like, as a layman, or, I mean, I can't make art, and I spent a career working in the arts. It's a unique proposition to be able to participate in a work of art in that way, and say that, like, you know, if Ai Weiwei wants to build Good Fences Make Good Neighbors, which is a public art fund project here in New York City about 4 years ago, if he wants to do that, like, did I ever think that I could have some relationship to Weiwei? Like, is that something that I could have seen for myself? But by giving the project simply $20, I've now become sort of a participant in it. So I would say that Kickstarter also operates itself in many ways as kind of a social practice platform, because you are inviting across the board a creative or a person into a creative project. Beyond that, I mean, obviously the project runs, it's successful. There's simply a list of backers at the end if your project is funded that you do receive, and you have communication with them throughout. But we do try sort of offline to facilitate creator to creator connections. And that being, I have two artists who are friends who don't know each other, and one of them is trying to launch something and needs to borrow money. And I know that this person would be interested in the idea, and I might connect them so that then they can have sort of that offline moment. And we also, pre-COVID, had a creators in residence program, which is not sort of a typical residency. It meant that we brought in sort of one person per creative category that we represent, and gave them sort of expert guidance through the process of either about to launch, running, or fulfilling on their project. But in that, we also hosted weekly meetings where all of these different artists, makers, filmmakers, writers, designers got to sit together and collaborate and talk about, like, what are the challenges in a creative process? How are you overcoming them in your industry? And from that, we actually ended up seeing a lot of these people collaborate and run projects together, which is pretty cool, like from totally disparate places that you wouldn't have thought of. So that's sort of one of the other ways that we do it. You know, you asked also what's missing. And I think that's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. So some people in this room know this, but I have spent basically the last year fundraising. And we are, again, a for-profit company. We're a public benefit corporation, which means we are for-profit, but we hold our mission above the needs of our shareholders. It is a legal status. It's different than just being B Corp certified. It is like a full legal entity. And in that, we produce a report every year on how we've upheld our mission and our charter and the ways in which we've done so. So we're very public with and transparent with what we do. Same with money that's funded on the platform. That is always on. It's actually now right at the header on our platform. We updated our homepage this week. So it shows you how many projects have been funded, how much money was pledged, et cetera. And that's always available and has been. But in analyzing this, one thing about data, which is an interesting sort of circle back, is that we never collected demographic data. And that was a choice because we knew we were never going to sell or use our data that we have internally anywhere other than to benefit our creators. And it's also a risky thing to keep demographic data. It is legally very protected in the United States. But we realized that even if we are, yes, a global company, we were founded in North America, we are reflective of the societal or the systems that surround us, you know, capitalism particularly being the biggest one, but historically what that has done to communities of color. And so we sort of did some fundraising, and it's not live yet, it will be soon, but we funded a fund to support Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx creators in the United States launching projects on Kickstarter. And the idea is to give them 5 to 10% of their project goal at launch. And this is a way, just what I was saying before, about signaling that the project is funding well publicly to encourage other people to back. It's also meant to alleviate some of the concerns from those communities who historically haven't had access to community wealth, to generational wealth. and a way for us long term to hopefully not only alleviate their experience and the pain points, but also maybe start to like create more diversity in each of these different marketplaces. And I think an example of that would be to think about many of the things that have been funded on Kickstarter that people have in their everyday life, like Peloton, like Oculus, Floyd Detroit Bed, Allbirds shoes. All those things were funded on Kickstarter by white creators. So what if we had those ideas from creators of color? And they probably exist. There's probably just been a holdup in being able to, or confidence and ability to run a project of that scale. So if we're able to alter that, are we then down the line able to start to create community wealth? Because what if these businesses and these creative entrepreneurships sort of go off and take off and become successful? Are we then creating something that's giving wealth back into its community, which then would lead to generational wealth over time? So it's something we're working on. We are now collecting demographic data because you have to be of one of those communities in order to have access to these funds as securely and safely as possible through both surveys, and then also people completely can write in and opt in to be a part of this. So that's sort of where we're at, but I think that the other part, I guess, of that fund that's interesting is that it's, to Jessica's work, spans a foundation to a nonprofit to us. So that money is coming from a foundation through a nonprofit partner that I shouldn't name until it's all public to us to help disperse. So we are working closely in collaboration with a nonprofit in order to disperse those funds.
So I'm excited to hear something that you're talking about, and I think Althea can probably speak to it as well, which is that you're creating, you're pioneers in a different kind of a network, because this network is not one that the kind of thing that we've seen before. It's the compilation of resources, of opportunity, of distribution, visibility, investment. I mean, we heard yesterday Kick started out with, talking, included Laura Callanan from Upstart Collab, that whole impact investment realm. And I'm excited to hear that this is taking on a completely new opportunity that could influence a particular group, could influence a lot of things, the diversity and inclusion going forward. So bravo to that. More to come, more questions to come. I'm going to jump past Rasmus and go over to Althea, because I think that you had a lot of experience probably in a similar way of the challenges of how do you get people who are really working so independently to feel like they're part of a community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a network right there that is, is ripe for a lot of work. So tell us about that.
Sure. So, when I think about the networks that we have engaged with, the first one that pops to mind is obviously the Etsy seller community. And when I joined Etsy in 2012, 2013, I think there were just about 1 million sellers on Etsy. There are now over 5 million sellers who sell items on Etsy, artisans. Almost all of them are women. I think it's 88% of them are women, and they're almost all businesses of one working out of their homes. I think it's about 1/3 of them, their creative business is their sole occupation. And then for the rest of them, it supplements other types of income. I think we see a lot of, you can imagine like a graphic designer who also sells stationery or cards on Etsy and is combining income from multiple sources. I always saw my role at Etsy as really being sort of like a community organizer of our sellers and of organizing what is really in many ways a membership organization of, in addition to being an e-commerce platform. When we were thinking about our advocacy and policy work and our social impact work, which are the areas that I led, really thinking about how do we sort of make sure that we are understanding, listening to, and representing the needs of that community in an authentic way. And it is a very, it's a diverse community. It's a lot of people. When I think about the networks that we're missing, as online platform. I think a lot about the digital divide and obviously like lack of access to reliable broadband and internet, and those issues I think have really come into stark relief with the pandemic and everybody relying on their computers even more. And for sure, that's a challenge that disproportionately is felt by BIPOC communities and rural communities. And, you know, when Etsy started, we really grew very quickly by word of mouth, and that can create insular communities, right? Where, you know, people who know each other are talking to each other and letting them know about it. And so we really did have to invest more intentionally into reaching out to communities that are not, you know, weren't just automatically coming to Etsy. So I think about a project we worked on last year that's a really good example of this with the Gee's Bend Quilters, which is a group of women from Gee's Bend, Alabama. Almost all of them are descendants of slaves that worked on the same plantation in the area, hugely acclaimed for their amazing quilts that are these incredible abstract designs, and they were featured in the Whitney and all these amazing institutions, and yet the women of this community had never actually earned income from their quilts. And so the average income in Gee's Bend is $12,000 a year. And so we partnered with a nonprofit called Nest, which works with artisans around the world and in the US, more in the US lately, but most of their work has been overseas before that. They brought in a community organizer who went to Gee's Bend and helped the women there with whatever they needed. Some women needed help with product photography, others needed bank accounts, whatever it was, you know, got their quilts online, and now they're selling them for, you know, $10,000, $12,000, like more than what the average income was in that community beforehand. And I think, you know, I think it's a really good example of trying to make sure that you're being intentional and thoughtful about reaching out to the communities that aren't part of the networks that are coming to you already, to make sure that we are spreading the economic opportunities that platforms like Etsy and Kickstarter and others create.
Yeah, and to, you know, to something that Patton said, you know, you may be contributing to a community that reinvests, you know, that they become the investor going forward based on the success that they're having, and that generationally you could be creating something that's much more sustainable and long lasting. So Rasmus, I am really interested in the new program that has come out of the Creative Business Network that is looking at trying to train policymakers and administrators, and it's I think that is not even a tangential network. I think it's a critical one. That's my opinion. But tell us more about your work and how you are building your networks going forward.
Sure. Thank you, Susan. Here at the Creative Business Network, we try to couple creative skills with entrepreneurial skills. And we have been working since 2009, and in 2012 we said, why don't we make a kind of a World Cup for the entrepreneurs, or for those that would like to become entrepreneurs in the creative industries. And we had 17 countries joining us that year, and now we're up to some 80 countries around the world that try to make that match between creativity and entrepreneurship. And in every country, we have different stakeholders. Some of them are public sector stakeholders, like in Austria, it's the Austrian Wirtschaftsservice, so the Austrian Bank for Enterprise Development. And in others, it's the Beijing, the Chinese government's main accelerator called InnoWay in Beijing. And we discovered that on one hand, we trained the startups and helped them grow. And in the chat, I put those that were the top startups the last 2020 and 2021. So you have an idea of what we're talking about. A lot of them are focused on sustainability these last 2 years. But also, we run this program for the stakeholders, either the policymakers, the civil servants, or the politicians for that matter, that try to get a grasp of the creative economy and see what should they do, what kind of measures can they implement. And it's not all about funding. It's not just about money and support. It's also about different measures, openness. Also, there's a reason why cultural culture has been exempted from the WTO, World Trade Organization deals, etc., because it's quite powerful and also quite close to the governments in many ways. And as an example, for example, in Denmark, we are a small country with 5.6 million Danish speakers. So if we still want to have a Danish movie industry, we need to support it with funding. But do we also need to keep like American and British movies out? One of the ways that we can make sure that, because it comes back to also when we talk about diversity, if all the movies are in English, can we still see ourselves in them? Can now down to those of the games, can young girls find themselves in these computer games that are all white men that are the heroes? So we're actually also together with some partners in an EU Horizon Europe project where we're trying to look at the impact of the gaming industry onto culture and perception and identity. So, but for the CIPS, as we call it, the Creative Industries Policy Seminar, here we have fantastic speakers from around the world. We have, Felipe Buitrago from the Inter-American Development Bank speaking about the orange economy. We have Rian Leuning, who is in charge of bringing Austrian startups out in the world, or Austrian creativity out in the world. We have Petra Tarjane from Finland, who's been working on how to implement the creative industries innovation policy instead of enterprise policy. And in many ways, there are lots of pockets of people around the world that really have done a great job there. I know Tom talked about evidence, and it is actually possible to do policy without much evidence or contra-evidence. For example, just look at the agricultural policy of the UK and the European Union throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was definitely contrary to the interest of both the farmers and the citizens that we had those kind of policies implemented. It was, and that I think when it comes to the culture and creative industries, it is a mixture that is rather complex, because it is about, of course, industry development, like what Susan is working on in Arlington, trying to also attract some companies and make it attractive to set up business there. It is also related to identity of a country, so moreover in the cultural sector and the arts and cultural ministries, cultural heritage. We also see foreign affairs. We can use the cultural industries as a tool for foreign policy. In Denmark, when the World Expo was in Shanghai in 2010, we did something very clever. One of the few Western readers or authors that they could read in China was actually Hans Christian Andersen, and they had read, most of them, The Little Mermaid. So we took the actual statue from the harbor of Copenhagen onto a boat and sailed it to Shanghai and put it inside this pavilion. And it was the second most visited pavilion of that expo, simply because of a story told by Hans Christian Andersen about this Little Mermaid, and then a statue that was made, I think it was maybe 50 years later, by a Danish sculptor and put in the harbor, just like mannequin fish in Brussels. So they are, just want to say that they can be quite powerful, and they can also be quite dangerous, and it can be used in different ways. We had about estimated 136 people died in 2005 and 2006 following the cartoons made by some Danish cartoonists with the Prophet, and that actually created so many riots around the world and the burning of the Danish flag, and in total they counted on some 136 people died in those riots. So the complexity of the creative economy and the creative industries makes it something that is difficult for policymakers often to grasp, and where should it be placed, and often it's placed in the cultural sector, and then suddenly a minister from the enterprise and innovation will grab it, and is it really education at the end of the day, because we need to have some good filmmakers, etc. So we're creating this, we have it already, we've done it for quite some time, but we're also structuring it a bit better, this network of policymakers and of those that want to influence the policymakers. Those of you who want to know what to say to when you meet your senator or you meet your representative, and tell them what are the different measures that they can can implement. And it's not all about send us more money, although there is also some of these artistic expressions that can only exist if they are supported somehow by the government. We wouldn't have a Danish movie industry, to get back to that, unless it was supported with 500 million Danish kroner, because you can never make, I think it's very, very rare, a movie in Denmark will make enough money to cover the budget of a movie, even if everyone went in to see it. It's very rare that a movie will make that much money that it can actually cover the costs. So there is there will be some like National Ballet, National Opera, etc., that will require that. I also put in the chat, by the way, the Kickstarter in the Kickstarter campaign from Rococo. Rococo started in 2013 and came to us as Cinema del Arte. These were two guys that graduated from the film school in Denmark, which is quite renowned film school, and they came with this product with something that was in Tupperware boxes almost on the back of them, which was how to make motion capture with where it's not cameras in the corners, as they did with Gollum in Lord of the Rings. Actually, a suit that you could wear, and then suddenly you could become Tom and Jerry and do your own little cartoons. And these were guys that were actually educated to become film producers, but they thought, why don't we make a different way of actually interactive cartoons or any motion, so that you can actually make animation that is actually that you can create right there, because usually you would say an animation is made and then it's run and it's a narrative that's not really, you can't deviate, but you could do that there. And they also discovered they could treat children with autism, because you could have a psychiatrist or psychologist to take on a suit and then appear before the child as this bear or this animal and speak to the child and reach the child in a different way. But they went on Rococo, and they also went to San Francisco, as everyone is supposed to do in the tech industry. But now they're back in Denmark. They're doing really well, and that's thanks to partly a Kickstarter campaign where they were able to then contact and reach out to all their creative business startups that they met over the years, and that were all in there supporting them. And I'm sure there are also other of our startups that have been to Kickstarter or Indiegogo that have been successful in raising funds through their communities. I must say, often those communities disappear on these platforms. They go in there, they support, and then they withdraw somehow and go back to where they came from. That is our experience, but that's good still that they raised the funding that they wouldn't have otherwise.
That's such a great story, and it really speaks a lot to the variety of ways that people are really looking to make their creative endeavors really thrive. I want to go back to a question that I think came up in our prep time together, is how do we ensure creative workers' needs and rights are centered in creative economy networks? And I think that we've each touched on the fact that this is, to some degree, it's always a touch and go situation with creative endeavors. One time they may have something that really takes off, and then the next moment they're, the next project that they do may not be quite as successful. So, I mean, there's a lot behind that question. I mean, there are no easy answers, but you all have had some observations and some views, and I'd like to hear what you think about what are some of the ways that we can ensure that rights and needs are considered and centered in our networks. I don't call on anybody. I'm just going to ask one of you to jump off on that. Althea, though, you look like you're ready to go.
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think that insisting that creative workers are included in every conversation and making sure that we're creating space for them to lead, not just with their stories and experiences, which is so important, but also with their analyses of the problems and ideas for how to solve them, are there, and that they're there in the rooms where decisions are being made. And I think that's so important. And, you know, people come to the table, I think, with so many preconceived notions about who creative workers are and what their challenges are, and sort of different depending on who you have in your mind. But I could give an example of, you know, I did a lot of work with policymakers advocating for Etsy sellers. And, you know, as creative business owners, I would walk into a room with a policymaker, and almost always they would assume that I was coming in to talk about access to capital, because they had in their mind that these are small business owners and small business owners need loans. And no Etsy seller wanted a loan. Everybody was so proud to be like bootstrapping their business, and took it as a point of pride that they had never taken a loan. And instead, when we would bring Etsy sellers into the room, they'd be talking about access to benefits or childcare, opportunities to build and connect with their network and their community, or the post office, or other things that were sort of more front of mind. And you could kind of see policy, like their policymakers' sort of mental frame shift as they were listening to, you know, these women talk about their actual lived experience trying to start and run their creative business. And I often found that after we brought Etsy sellers in to meet with policymakers, those same policymakers would reach out to me for examples and stories that they could include in their speeches as examples of to try to make real the policies that we were pushing for. And I think that is so powerful, but that doesn't happen unless you have actual creative workers in the room to shift those frames.
So from that perspective, it was happening because it was an important way to really keep the sector really thriving, because without all of that, without that sort of policy backdrop, everything still remains incredibly fragile. You know, Rasmus, I think you had something just brilliantly that you said in our earlier call about if we solve the problems of the creative workers, you know, from a labor market standpoint, we'd probably solve the problems of every industry sector. You remember that?
Yeah. I remember we talked about how, for example, Uber is not present here in Denmark because if an Uber driver gets sick, how are they going to get a sick leave? Or if they become pregnant, you know, how can they take the 1 year maternity leave and still get 90% of the salary? So that's obviously a problem. And I would like to remind you that Denmark is not run by communist governments, but usually right-wing and conservative governments that still endorse this kind of policy, because the better your neighbor is doing, the better the rest of us are doing. So we have been researching and finding evidence that the society and the labor markets pushed by, you know, the Airbnbs and the Ubers in a way that that kind of challenges the Nordic Scandinavian labor market model of that if you lose your job, you're not also into a social deroute. You can still manage to pay for food for your kids and your house, and while you look for another job. And in that way, it's also quite easy to fire someone. It's not that difficult to fire someone that you hire, and if it's a mistake, and you know that they won't be completely sent out to be homeless in the street. But we're going in a different direction, and that direction looks very much like the way that most artists are working. You know, that they are not in full-time employment. My dad was 42 years with the same company, and he's not Japanese or Chinese. This notion that we will have working in networks, who will own our IP, and these kind of issues. If we can find a model for that, if we can find a way that if you as a young ceramist being copied by a huge retailer like Walmart or Kmart or what it could be, Walgreens, then you would actually have someone behind you to support you in challenging that copy by the larger retailer. That could be one example of how we can make these cooperatives bring back the idea. This is why we have such a strong agricultural sector in Denmark, due to the cooperatives. Can we somehow use the cooperative model or other ways of making sure that if we fix this right now, the labor market for the creatives, we could maybe also have fixed it for all of us in 10 or 20 years time. And that's, we haven't found the solution for it yet because there's so many models around the world, but I think we need to look into how that can be done. Yeah, it's not easy, but we're working towards that.
No, that is so important. And I think that, you know, with that sense that creative workers really thrive on the flexibility of being able to have an independent path, they also need to be sure that they have the support, whether it is through, you know, a public sector or whether it's through, you know, a cooperative or whatever it needs to be, that they're no less in need of all those things than everybody else. And, you know, that's really quite telling. So I think we have time for a couple more questions before we turn it over to answering any Q&A. So, you know, we heard a lot yesterday about outreach and connectivity alongside the need to disrupt systems that are no longer effective. I don't know if you, so I think this would be a time for you to each weigh in on, you know, where do you see these industry champions? What kinds of networks? Who are these industry champions? Are they just funders? Are they just people in leadership? Or are they people in other industries? I'd like to hear your thinking around who these industry champions are, who the researchers and entrepreneurs are that need to be networked together.
I'm happy to jump in, but I also want to address just really quickly the thought about social safety networks and creative workers, and then get into kind of the agency and industry side of things. But I think one thing that we saw a lot of what happened in COVID was this, you know, the truth was always there, but there was this unveiling of how dire the situations were for individual creative workers and artists in the United States without those kinds of social safety networks that Rasmus is talking about that exist in Europe. And you know, we heard a lot from local arts agency grant makers who were, you know, very quickly moving into ways to support individuals and the people, and were able to raise a lot more money, emergency relief money, because they were talking about, you know, this data point that we kind of uncovered of 63% of all artists and creative workers in the United States became fully unemployed. And that's a huge, huge number. And so, you know, to be able to start to think about the individual and move the agency a little bit to the back seat is a really important mental and cultural shift in this country, I think. And you know, a lot of the speakers yesterday talked about the nonprofit model and how we know it's challenging. We know it can be exclusionary. And if we widen our frames to think about what are the networks that exist outside of the agency model. And I ask that question, it's kind of rhetorical because many artists and culture bearers and community organizers have worked for decades outside of the nonprofit 501c3 model here in the States. But funders and local arts agencies haven't always valued those networks. And when you prioritize the agency and you value them as legitimate, then all of a sudden the individuals and the artists become less legitimate in terms of funding. There was a conversation around risk and capital yesterday that I thought was so powerful. So I want to think about, you know, what does that look like? Who are we valuing? What is the frame? Who is the field? And then also, what does it look like when the economy starts moving again? Will the inertia go back to this desire for stability, or will we start to hold space for relationships and people-based operations. And so again, to kind of lift up some of those speakers from yesterday, especially around the session on social cohesion, which I thought was just so beautiful. In thinking that, when we talk about networks and we talk about industry, my mind in some ways first goes to what are the professional networks, but then how do we go back to our personal spaces, and do we want to merge those two? And are the networks built on relationship and right relationship with land, with people, with non-human people and beings? A friend of mine shared something the other day with me, whose friend told them, friend of a friend, that said, whiteness has been a multi-generational project of radical disconnect. And so when we start to think about people and frame and network and practice, I hope we can think about where those disconnections have happened and how we can support people in institutions and alongside one another to help build these social safety networks. It's going to take a long cultural shift here in the States, but I don't think we can move forward in a new way. If we're talking about the creative economy, what does the inclusive creative economy mean? We have to be in right relationship with one another and with our institutions.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that?
I would also chime in, and I think it kind of hits both of the last points, but I think and I unfortunately missed this risk conversation yesterday, but trust. I think that's like the biggest thing that we have to focus on in terms of presenting what a creative economy is. Because I think, especially in talking to a lot of funders over the last year, there is this, and not all funders are in this space, but there are some who are far more radical who, like, of course, want to directly give to artists. But I think that there's a risk assessment for them of like not understanding that creative work doesn't go A, B, C, D, E, that it goes A, B, W, C, A again. Like it doesn't follow the same, this sort of linear path that we have in sort of entrepreneurial business mindset. And so to teach someone, and I think actually just to shout out one funder, but Mackenzie Scott's gift, like her last round of giving that primarily went to arts and culture organizations in the United States. I don't know if anyone read the letter that she wrote, but it was heavily, heavily about trusting those organizations to do the good work that they've been doing and not restrict where that money is going. They have it, they know their community, and they should operate in the best way that they can. And I think that it's sort of funny that that's so radical, but at least in the United States, that's how we funded. We have an expectation of like, okay, I'm going to give you this money. It's almost like the RFP process. I'm going to give you this money and it's going to end up here. That's exactly, I want it to look exactly like that mock-up that you gave me. And that's just not how a creative worker exists. I mean, we have hundreds of examples on Kickstarter of what we would call like failure, where the project didn't deliver exactly what it was supposed to, but then ended up taking 3 other turns and ended up being something so much more incredible and beautiful as a result of it. And I think maybe that's on the industry to champion the fact that creative work isn't the same as everything else. It doesn't follow these same sort of business capitalist metrics that we have. There has to be an underlying sense of trust between the funder, the person who's working with the artists themselves and who they're working with. And I think that's a big part of probably all of our roles, is also engendering trust with the creatives that we choose to work with. Because I think I start from a place of, and I feel very fortunate to work at a company like Kickstarter, where our values are laid out clearly, and like we aren't beholden to shareholders. We are profitable, we can make decisions ourselves. So to be able to give that as an underlying sense of trust, I think certainly helped me work with the artists and the organizations that I choose to collaborate with.
Well, that term about trust did come up and it was a thread in a number of the conversations yesterday, and I think that it feeds directly to your comment about trust between the funding, and that's where the whole conversation I think came up about disrupting the systems that are in place that have some expectations of the recipient that may be unrealistic, that just don't fit what they're actually looking to accomplish. And so I think that there is probably a huge opportunity to kind of reimagine what that those funding mechanisms, and there were several people from Grantmakers in the Arts on a couple of those calls. So I think that we heard a lot about that yesterday.
I placed a link. Sorry, Susan, I placed a link.
No.
One of the links, the last one I placed was a game called Limbo that came out, I think it's almost 10 years now, and it was first supported by the Danish Arts Council because the artistic value of this game was so high. It's a little boy who's trying to save his younger sister in a dark, gloomy Nordic Scandinavian forest, and it received the initial funding from an artistic point of view as a grant because it had this high quality artistically. But then it went on to become number 5 on Xbox or something like that. So funders need to realize that there is often both, and they're not necessarily contrary. There's often been this notion that a real artist does not have commercial success. I don't think that really is the case anymore. I think we have gone beyond that. I thought that was just a good example. And the other link I put in was also related to the issue of trust. And if you open the link, you can see the first picture. You'll see Anna Black. She's a ceramist I mentioned before. Her business was practically destroyed when a company comparable to Target, I would say, one of the largest retailers, the second largest retailer in Denmark, did something that, if you look at the pictures, pretty much is copied. But they were, due to the size and the lawyers that they had employed, they were able to run her business into the ground, even though she won at the end of the Supreme Court and went through the case. But by then, her business was out. So it's also about, for funders around the world, and no, not just the US, that we have to respect the cultural heritage and respect that comes from the creatives. And I would have said to the retailer that if they had been in doubt whether they would have copied her, they should have stayed away. We have to really be careful that we don't stifle the creativity of people by this immense copy that takes place all the time, whether you're big or small. And I also see that, for example, Walgreens, I think, in Walmart, they have a page where if you think they have been infringed upon, you can go in there and claim it. But I think it's something that really is hurting a lot, because that is the value that's often created. The value is symbolic. It's not the materials or the function or whatever it is, something that can usually quite easily be copied.
So Patton, that makes me ask, does Kickstarter work with any of the people that are on your platform to educate them or help them with patents or copyrights?
I actually don't believe we do, but that is also lies more firmly with our design and technology team, which means, and they have more stringent rules than any other category on the platform, just because there's a lot of risk. In our early days, people were putting up, they were putting up projects for like a prototype. It wasn't even a prototype of something,
right.
Something that they'd drawn in Google SketchUp. We do, if we see projects come on the platform that are direct copies of something that are do have copyright issues, we have a legal team that goes and basically shuts down that project. So we are looking, like everything that comes on the platform, I look at every visual and performing arts project that comes on the platform every day, and the same for my counterparts. So we flag things, and we are, industry experts in that space too.
Well, I'm sure that digitally produced items can be embedded with, some copyright protection seals, but physical things are harder to protect in that way. Althea, did you see much of that? The concern about making sure that individuals were representing their own work and that they were protected?
Yeah, it goes both ways, I think, Nancy, right? So there's a good amount of trying to make sure that our sellers understand copyright law themselves and that they're not just throwing Disney stuff up there or what have you. And then on the other side, for sure, there's a large concern about creators having their work ripped off and sold on Amazon or other places. And in that case, we do try to point them towards resources to help with that, and also, frankly, advocate for better protections on the policy side for them. But those can it's complicated. It can go both ways in terms of sometimes the protections that we build to help small creators can actually end up making them the targets of sort of copyright trolls or otherwise.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
so it's a tricky area, I would say.
Definitely a tricky area. I've heard a lot of things throughout our conversation today that really speak to the fact that these questions, or these, especially in the topic of networks, are similarly shared. They're more universal than we think. You know, that creators across the globe often face a lot of the same concerns, issues of how to thrive and grow. So probably the last question before we see if there are any questions coming in is, how can we bring the United States more fully into global networks and have dialogue on the creative economy? I think that, you know, we've seen that it's pretty easy. You know, you go back to what you're doing after you've been exposed to an incredible assortment of people, and you listen to what everybody's saying from a lot of different parts of the US and a lot of different parts of the world. And we don't want it to stop. You know, what can happen? What do you each think could happen to really strike a better connection on a global scale? Jessica, I mean, you're Americans for the Arts, but maybe it's Americans for all arts around the world. You know, you don't have to change your name, but.
Oh, thanks, because I definitely don't have power to do that. Yeah, I think there's so much opportunity in that space, and I am really excited about the ways that people have been coming together across sectors through the pandemic. I don't want that to go away when, again, people start to find a little bit of stability and whatever normal is, but normalcy or routine, maybe even it is in their lives. This notion of working closer together in coalition, that, you know, Americans for the Arts is, you know, one of the larger organizations on the Hill advocating for arts and culture, pro-arts policy, but that doesn't mean that we should be or have to be the only people in that space. And I hope that we can strengthen these relationships and coalitions so that we can then all, you know, use our strengths, our different strengths, to show up in international spaces. And that may be stronger relationships with the United Nations Commission on Trade and Development Creative Economy Program. Who can we send in delegation collectively as representatives of the United States inclusive creative economy sector to participate in those kinds of programs and conversations? Who can we work with, you know, in Europe, and again, not have that just lie with us as a large industry association. Certainly we can bring our networks and networks of networks and be representative, but I'm particularly, again, excited about these cross-sector partnerships and relationships and how we can work in coalition together.
I see a few questions. I'd like to give you each an opportunity if you have any other thoughts that you've listened to, your colleagues on this panel that you've heard that you didn't get a chance to share before I read one or two of the questions.
Oh, just one thing I wanted to add into the mix. When we were talking about where do we see the networks of industry champions, I think obviously there's all the people who currently work in the creative industries, but some of the work we've been doing has been looking at the education system and skills pipelines and how people actually find their way into the creative industries. And I think that's a whole network that needs to be considered that has a really profound effect on the health of the entire sector. So we've done some research on production centres within the UK. I don't know if this is the same everywhere, but we definitely perceive there to be labour shortages, there's a lack of diversity, and there's
Mhm.
an education system that isn't really creating an effective talent pipeline. It's actually, the education system in parts of the UK is quite antiquated, and it can't move at the speed that technology in the digital world is really driving things. So I think on the one hand, there's the need to develop and engage with the networks of people who are already working in the space, but then we also need to think about what the bridge is from education through to the industries to make sure that's, if it's not smooth, because I guess no one has a kind of smooth move into employment, but at least the routes are understandable, and there are some kind of overarching support mechanisms which can help people.
Yes, yeah, education and training, it's a whole other network and topic that we didn't even get to touch on, but I think may come up in other sessions. But so I'm going to read a couple of the questions that have come in from Jen Cole. What is the one? I know there are a lot, but if we could, as a sector, focus in one place, tax policy, labor policy, what is the one policy shift we could do in the short term that would move us toward people process-centered networks? Would love to hear your thoughts, domestic and global. Brandon, were you supposed to be reading that question?
All right, I'm happy to have you read it. I'll be happy to read it.
No, you can do the rest. They're very tiny. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, first I just want to say thank you all for your input and your discussion. It's been very enlightening for a person that's a bit more of a novice into the world of creative economy. And so one thing I wanted to just mention on Jennifer's question is, I think we all understand there's so many different elements we can focus on. But as an individual, and perhaps someone myself that's a little less well-versed in the creative economy, what is one of the bigger focuses is an individual focus that we could, as individual members of this economy, and put some work into?
I'll jump in on that. I think for me, and maybe I'm a little bit of like a one note, so I don't know what the right word is, one trick pony. I do think the labor policy, and particularly around expanding social protections for people who work outside of traditional employment, whether that be artists and creatives, or domestic workers, or taxi drivers, or people who drive on Uber, or what have you. I think I was really inspired by many of the conversations yesterday, hearing about Springboard for the Arts working on a guaranteed minimum income pilot, and what Cezanne was saying about general operating funds for artists. And I think building on what you were saying, Jessica, around COVID relief and sort of refocusing on the individual artists in addition to the sort of broader support infrastructure and ecosystem is so important, and would make a huge difference in the lives of many creatives. Our challenges that are faced not just in the US, but also in Europe, and I think many Americans are surprised to learn that, but it is true. The social safety net challenges, I think, are there in different ways in different countries, but there still is a divide between those who earn income through self-employment versus those who are employed through traditional employment. And I think it creates a ton of opportunities to build new networks and to connect, the domestic workers movement with the creative economy movement, and really to think, as we're talking about networks and how do we build these networks, how do we see ourselves as participants in a movement and movement builders, and think about that as our role as we think about who, to go back to your question at the beginning, Susan, about who are we not including, being really intentional about who are the people who share the challenges that our communities face, and how do we build bridges to the organizations that are led by and represent those groups to build stronger coalitions for, a more robust safety net overall?
Yeah, the shared concerns are something that I think we haven't really completely taken advantage of, for sure. Anybody else have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I have two ideas for policies that could be implemented quite, not easily necessarily, but I'm sure that governments, local, national governments in the US all fall under the WTO rules of public procurement. And it's a general rule that the public market is a difficult market for the small creatives and SMEs. we're actually doing launching a series of sessions on that on the 14th of October on how can open innovation take place in the public sector? How can the public sector work with creatives in buying their services? It is quite difficult for many of the creatives to do that. So, but there are actually ways to do it, and we're getting some best practices from Helsinki, Stockholm, and Paris on the 14th of October on how public sector can. It's a big, huge market that the creatives should tap into. Another one would be internationalization, especially for American and Chinese creatives. It's always a good exercise to try and sell abroad and to go abroad with your ideas and your products. It is not just for the sake of a larger market, but it's also we have mighty networks, as some of you know. I had to make them aware that they on their website write foreign numbers, and for me, they have a foreign number. That they are too US-centric in the way that they were writing things, and they actually changed it after we made them aware of that. So open innovation in the public sector, strengthening that, and working with creatives in the public sector, and then internationalization for creatives. I think it really is a good exercise for especially those from the large countries like the US and China.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. Appreciate that. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on this before we move on to another question?
I just have one thought, which is, well, first, I think I definitely echo what's been said about social safety nets. And I know we've been doing work that's looked at the plight to freelancers and the kind of protections they have and the kind of representation they have within political structures, which are often not as prominent as other types of workers. So I absolutely would endorse those points of view. But I think maybe an obvious point, but something that certainly keeps coming up in conversations we have with our international council is the discrepancy in power between the big tech companies, which seem to control so much of the creative industry landscapes at the moment, many of which are housed in the USA, and the needs of individuals to have access to affordable technology because their life chances are affected by their interaction with the digital world. So I think in terms of what the USA could do, it's I don't know quite how it would happen, but there's definitely work that needs to be done around trying to level out those power imbalances across the technology landscape.
I also would add, Jen, your question is like trying to pick your favorite movie, because there's just so many good ones out there. But I think that I'm going to also jump on this social safety network, so social safety net bandwagon, and uplift the Economic Security Project, who is working on universal basic income and anti-monopoly action, and that there are a lot of opportunities for change in regulations in ways that can protect and lift up individual workers and artists. And I also want to call out portable benefits, because there are these really basic needs that individual workers have so much trouble accessing. And those are huge policy platforms, but I think can be overcome. And I also want to hope that in the international space that the United States could learn from a lot of the developing countries that are centering inclusive creative economy and creative economy for sustainable development. This whole year has been the United Nations year on creative economy for sustainable development. And there is so much incredible work happening across the globe. So both agencies and institutions have a lot to learn. And I think we as individuals, Brandon, to get to your question of what can I do as one person, to be learning and telling those stories in our communities and be trying to uplift things that are happening across the globe, rather than, but in addition to seeing all of the complexity of a highly industrialized nation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. Appreciate that. To move on to one of our next questions, Kurt Elfman had asked a question regarding business structure and how can we create businesses, be it a benefit, public corporation, a nonprofit, starting or while having an existing business, how can we connect to nonprofit arts organizations and create revenue streams that support nonprofit arts organization operations? So creating, I think, in this question, creating a business that's not solely focused on the nonprofit arts organization realm, but still showing its support via revenue streams. Anyone would like to jump in on that one?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, that's a
yeah. So part of being a PBC is that you make discernible commitments that are available for anyone to see, and that you report on how much you fulfilled those. One of our commitments was that we give 5% of our after-tax profits out every year. And so half of that money goes to arts and cultural organizations, and half of that money goes to diversity and inclusion organizations. And so I think the model of a PBC, obviously I'm clearly a champion of it, and I know Althea was at a B Corp, so she's probably somewhat a champion of it too, is to really think about your business as being something that's impactful and not, not about money. Like, money shouldn't be the sole driver of what, yes, you need it to continue to be successful, but at the same time, we're talking about big tech. Kickstarter's only 100 people. Like, I don't think people realize how small the company is. And we did that, and we stayed small so that we could continue to maintain profitability and uphold our commitments to the organizations that we support. And even in that model, I work with nonprofits. I mean, museums and cultural organizations run Kickstarter projects. So there is another way for them to also tap into using a platform to help fund creative work and also get their message out to a much larger, more global audience than they would have previously. But maybe I should pass it to Althea too on the B Corp stuff.
Oh, I actually was going to go to, I'm all for creating independent revenue streams of different varieties. And actually, prior to Etsy, when I was at the Freelancers Union, that was a 501c4 organization that wholly owned a insurance company that funded the operations of the nonprofit. I think that's an interesting model. I think, we talked a lot yesterday about cooperative models, and I think those are really exciting and great. And, you look at sometimes I think about the cooperative ecosystem in Emilia-Romagna in Italy, which has like insurance companies and banks and all the different entities that are supporting each other. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here in the US to think about how could we build those kinds of models to create more like mutual aid organizations that support the broader ecosystem.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Althea. And thank you, Pat. Looks like we've got maybe time for one more question here. And I think this one that come from Terry Skillman's a really interesting one. So Terry states that the USA is not a signatory/party for UNESCO's intellectual property efforts. And he asks, or she asks, that wouldn't it be important for us to sign on so that USA could be better participate in these global creative industries? I mean, before we move on to the second part of the question, I'd be curious if anyone has just a general thoughts on that first question.
I generally have lots of thoughts about the US not signing on to international things.
Cool. Sure. And so then maybe perhaps the second question can prompt us a little bit better is, don't the USA's copyright laws conflict with other countries' copyright laws that impact the creative industries? If anyone's had any experience with that conflict, you could shed some light on it.
There are some differences, some clear differences. In the US, you can actually, the most famous one is that you can actually protect the one-click buy at Amazon. That wouldn't have been possible under European IP laws. But otherwise, this is really too specific for me to answer. But there are some differences. It's easier to protect something in the US that's related to software than it is in Europe.
One thing I would add in favor of US IP laws is that they include fair use, which many others don't. And that is something that Etsy sellers at least rely on quite a bit for building out their own creative works. And so that's one piece of US copyright policy I think creatives would benefit from.
Yeah, a DJ that makes a fantastic mashup, that should be possible.
Sure. So Pat, for example, with some of the Kickstarters that you work with, I'm assuming there's some that are based, outside of the US. When they're getting funding through US donors and patrons, are there any issues that arise based upon copyright law and things along those lines that you guys have to vet, or is that more within the tech teams as you had previously mentioned?
It's more within the tech teams. I mean, the things that we're looking to catch, I would say, on project pages are, and these are all built into our terms of use, and also into, frankly, our credit card processors' terms of use too, some of this stuff. But you can't, your rewards, which are what are given in turn for, I mean, you don't have to choose a reward to support a project. I frankly don't, because I would fill my house with crap. But some people find that very motivating. And so when you choose a reward, it should be something that's created that's new. So if we see something that's then listed elsewhere on the internet or something else, then that's one of the instances where we would shut down the project because it's not their individual creative work, and that goes against our terms. Sorry, I'm speaking specifically from like art spaces where I've seen it happen. I do think it's probably more problematic in the design and tech space, which is why the vetting is so much heavier. We also have a whole team within the company that's called Trust and Safety that does this. Like, that is their job, is to moderate projects, to look through them before launch. Everything's reviewed by them before anything can launch to make sure that it doesn't violate our terms. So I guess it's the best of what I can answer to that specifically.
Thank you. Well, it looks like we're already at the 11 o'clock time. Susan, you want to wrap this up? You would like to do one more?
You know, I did see that there was one, I saw one other question for Patton about how does Kickstarter determine eligibility or require proof from applicants for BIPOC restricted programs?
Sure. I mean, this is,
and you
it's
can be
opt-in. Yeah, I was going to say it's super quick. It's an opt-in functionality. So when you're building your project on Kickstarter's platform, there's a creator survey at the end. And if you go through that, there's a question where you can identify your demographics. The other is that there will be, when this is announced fully, a page in which you can actually submit your project, and there's 1 to 2 sentences you can write. And so in that space, you would identify yourself as being someone who would be eligible for that. Obviously, I can't look at a picture and make that choice. That's completely illegal and should be. So it's really completely an opt-in from the perspective of the creator.
I have to say thank you to all of you, including the background tech support and everybody at WestStaff who has really been at the ready to make this such a smooth sailing ship. Clearly, they provided a platform that's making these conversations so robust and so easy to have without interruption. That it's just been a real pleasure to be with all of you and to be part of this summit. So I look forward to the next 2. I think that I heard yesterday that WestStaff has committed to doing at least 2 more. So more to come. Thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.